Welcome to On the Way Classroom with Tony Crisp. Each weekday, Monday through Friday, Dr. Crisp will teach the Bible from its historical, geographical, linguistic, and cultural context. Tune in daily to start your day right and to deepen your understanding of how to better walk the way and enjoy the journey. Now, here's your host, Dr. Tony Crisp.
Welcome to On the Way Classroom. I'm Tony Crisp, and today we're going to continue our study of In the Fullness of Time. That's right, we are studying the silent 400 years between the closing of the Old Testament canon, when the last prophet of God, Malachi, thundered out God's word, and it was not spoken of again. That's right, there was no direct word from God through any prophetic utterance until Gabriel the angel was sent by God to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, where he said, your wife is going to bear the forerunner of the Messiah himself, as was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah and the other prophets. And so those years of silence, as it's called, those intertestamental periods between the Old and New Testament, were significant years, and they have been brushed over for years and years. But if we're going to learn the story of God, if we're going to learn history, His story, then we not only need to break down the passages that we have, what we call the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the writings, which I've done for you according to chronology and time periods, but we also need to understand that the New Testament is broken down chronologically and by time periods as well, and we're going to study those just like we did the Old Testament. And then we will study the period from the death, burial, resurrection, ascension of Jesus all the way to our modern day. And I put all of those together in 21 time periods. Yes, that's 3 times 7, that perfect number 3 times, which is another perfect number, which reaches 21, which is significant. But from the time of the book of Genesis and the events of creation up until our present time period, I divide those into 21 time periods. And so we have covered 10, and now we're covering this period called the Intertestamental Period. And we've learned about the Beit Knesset, which is called the synagogue in the New Testament, and you'll need to listen to the previous sessions to understand why that's so. And in the last session, I left us with Jesus in the synagogue at Nazareth, and here is where we are. The Torah portion that we learned about in the last 2 sessions has now been read. Now it is time for the guest rabbi or someone from the audience, a teacher, to come and to read the Haftarah. And that's exactly what Jesus did. Can you believe this, that in the fullness of time, God not only prepared the synagogue, the entity itself, He not only prepared Ezra and the Torah portions and the commentary on the Torah portions and the naming of the subject matter of the Torah portions. And not only was it to be read on Shabbat, but also read on Mondays and Thursdays, so there would not be over 3 days, starting into the 4th, that the Torah would not be read. Why? Because the people needed to know the words of God, so they would not disobey those, so that they would not be in captivity and scattered again as they had been under the hand of the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, and were still scattered during the days of Jesus. You've got to remember that except for the Hasmonean period, that the Jews had been in captivity from the time of Nebuchadnezzar in 605 all the way down to the Hasmonean period and the Maccabean revolt. And from that period, which is 167-ish, down to the period of 63 BC, 63 years before the birth of Christ, when Pompey came in and really overthrew everyone of Greek orientation or anyone else, simply because the Romans ruled with an iron fist, and the Hasmoneans, yes, they still had control, but they were under the sovereignty of Rome and not on their own anymore. And so there was a period there of over 100 years when the Hasmoneans were ruling the dynasty and the land. The Jewish people were free, and they expanded the girth and the depth of all of the land. They really conquered a lot of land and ruled over a lot, but that ended with the Romans. So except for a period of just over 100 years, the Jews were in captivity from the time of Babylon all the way till 1948, when they were brought back into the land and Ben-Gurion gavelled back in the state of Israel as an entity under its own sovereignty and an autonomous rule. And that will be the case until Messiah comes. Now, the reason I'm saying this to you is because when Jesus went in and he sat at that synagogue, and then he was handed the scroll. Notice, as you're reading through Luke chapter 4, the paragraphs start about Jesus going into the synagogue at about what we call verse 14. And then you come all the way down to what we would say verses 18, 19, somewhere in there, to where Jesus is handed the scroll, and he begins to read these places about Messiah, the setting free of the captives, of the giving sight to the blind, to causing the deaf to hear, the mute to speak, and all of these who are broken and bruised and battered. The Messiah will come and fix that. And then it's in about verses 18 or 19 that Jesus says to them, when he shuts the book, when it says that I have come to preach the acceptable year of the Lord, that Messiah would come and preach the acceptable year of the Lord, which is a reference back to the prophet Isaiah, which is a reference back to Leviticus chapter 25 and the year of Jubilee, and that reference. And Jesus said, when he closed the book, it says that all eyes were on him. You can read about this in Luke chapter 4. All eyes were on him. When he finished reading this Haftorah portion that had been laid out hundreds of years before the time of Jesus in the synagogue, that is, the Torah portion was laid out, the Haftorah portion was laid out, and now here in the fullness of time, when God was ready, the Messiah himself was in his own synagogue, in his own town where he had grown up, reading the portion about him. And that just all happened. No, it didn't. It was in the fullness of time. And the Bible says that Jesus closed the book, handed it back, handed the prophetic scroll of Isaiah back to him, and said, "This day, this is fulfilled in your hearing." Now, what was that all about? Well, the people knew, because then they tried to stone him and take him outside and throw him off of a cliff outside of the city itself. Why? Because they knew that he was claiming to be Messiah, because that was a messianic passage, and he had already had fame gathered around him and people gathered around him, and here he was in his hometown. They said, "Hey, isn't this Joseph's son? Isn't he the carpenter's son? Who's he? We remember when he was here growing up. He's not the Messiah." And so this is the situation. But what was it that got them so upset? It was the portion that he was reading, and that he brought that to bear and said, "I am the fulfillment of this." Well, what was that the fulfillment of? Well, he was reading in the prophetic passages having to do with the time when Messiah will come and set things right, that he will set the captives free. And this was a messianic passage that will have two fulfillments. One, that's a spiritual freedom, but it will also be fulfilled during the days of the millennium and the days of the Messianic era, the day when Jesus will reign personally and literally on the earth, physically, bodily on the earth. And he's capable of doing that, you know. And so the disciples thought he was going to do that in Acts chapter 1, because they asked him, after him speaking to them about the kingdom that was going to come for 40 days, which, by the way, that would have been a good time for Jesus to say, now, boys, I tell you, that kingdom thing, that's all spiritual. There is not going to be any fulfillment. I mean, yes, we're here on the Mount of Olives. Yes, I'm the Son of God. I'm the Messiah. And yes, you will rule with me. But and here's the temple, and we can rule. No, he said, it's not yet. When they said, Lord, is this the time? He said, not yet. He said, that's in the Father's time, but I've got a job for you to do until that time. And he gave them what is another version of the commission to go and be his witnesses, his martyrs, throughout all of the earth. And that's the word for witness in the Bible, is the word martyr. It's the Greek word for witness. And so the reason I'm telling you that is Jesus was telling them about the Messianic era. Now, that's in the last chapters of the book of Isaiah, but that is a reference back. This acceptable year of the Lord is a reference back to Isaiah 25, which is a reference back to Leviticus and the Torah portion of Leviticus 25. Remember, in Leviticus 23, you have the Moedim, that is the feasts, the festivals, and the fast days, the great holy days of Israel, and the calendar is given starting with Shabbat, ending at the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot, and all of that's in Leviticus 23. But in Leviticus 25, you have this special day. Remember, not only was there to be a Sabbath day every week, but there was to be a Sabbath year, a sabbatical year, every seventh year. You'd have 6 years of working the ground, and then God would give a great harvest, a surplus in the sixth year that would last all the way to the harvest time of the eighth year. So it was really enough for 2 years. And so the land was to have rest, and they were to depend on God, and that was part of their uniqueness as the people of God, this sabbatical year. But they did not follow that. And that's why they went into captivity. But God said, I want to have a special year of a special year. So he said, I want you to have a whole week of Sabbaths and sabbatical years. That means I want you to have a sabbatical year every seventh year, and then the next seventh year, that's the second day of the week, and that would be 7 times 7 years is 49 years. He said, I want you to count 49 sabbatical years, that is, I want you to count 49 years or 7 sabbatical years, a full 7-day week of years. And then on the 50th day, I want you to proclaim Yovel. We call that Jubilee. And he said, I want everything to revert back to its original owner because I don't want my people to be enslaved throughout their entire generations because they're going to make mistakes. They're going to get themselves in financial trouble, and I want them to have a way out. So every 50th year, we're going to let everybody start over. That was called the acceptable year, or the year of Yovel, or Jubilee in our language. When Isaiah was prophesying about the acceptable year of the Lord, he was saying, this is the year of fresh start. This is the time of fresh start. When Jesus said, this is fulfilled in your hearing today, what Jesus was saying about that passage about Jubilee in the synagogue in Nazareth on the day of Shabbat, what Jesus was saying is, I am the fulfillment of Jubilee, and in me, everyone gets a fresh start. Doesn't matter who you are, what you've done, Jesus will give you a fresh start. That is Jubilee. See you next time on the Way Classroom.
Thanks for listening to On the Way Classroom with Dr. Tony Crisp. Tune in each weekday for more information on how to read, study, and understand the Bible. If you have questions, please write to questions@tonycrisp.org. That's questions@tonycrisp.org. questions@tonycrisp.org. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day on the way.